and that is as it involves the general subgroups within the modern Jewish community. You have the Ashkenazi. Most people tend to be, I think, familiar with that. That might be the first one that comes to mind when they think of the modern Jewish people. Generally, Eastern, Central Europe, and Western Russia is where that specific subgroup kind of as culture kind of maybe more so develops overall, generally speaking. You have the Sephardic Jews who were very much from the Iberian Peninsula. That's Spain, Portugal. That's kind of where that subgroup's culture really fully developed. And then you have the Mizrahi, I think I'm saying that right, yeah, Mizrahi, which is more or less the Middle Eastern Jews, North Africa, and really in other parts of Asia as well. Ethiopian Jews are sometimes, depending who you ask, and if you ask an Ethiopian Jew, kind of their own subsect. However, they tend to be batched in under the Mizrahi Jews. But because of conversations I've had with some of them, I decided, hey, let me put that as its own subsect, since I know some of them prefer to think of themselves as a separate subsect. In any case, these are your general main groupings, subgroupings of the modern Jews today. And we will definitely, at times, make mentions of specifics of them, especially in the second and third part of the series. The one thing to know, in spite of what I have here about the general areas where their specific cultural attributes kind of developed, they're all around the world. All right? Before we even get to the 1800s, before we get to the 1700s, you have Ashkenazi Jews in the Middle East. You have Ashkenazi Jews throughout Western Europe. In the early 1800s, you definitely have some of them in the United States. The Sephardic Jews, you have whole bunches of them throughout the Middle East by the time you even get to 1500 AD. My point in saying that is that as it involves all these groups, despite that general specific area where they kind of had their cultural start, so to speak, they spread throughout the world way before we even get to modern Israel. And you had a presence of them in the land before we get to modern Israel, for sure. As usual for my stuff, we'll do Q&As, comments, and stuff at the end, okay, if you're able to. All right, so that is the general gist of that as it involves the subgroups. Looking at the Middle East, leading up to the time when you get modern Israel, you have more or less Arab and or Muslim control of the whole area. After Muhammad and Islam started in 600 AD and after, you get that. So here I got a few maps to kind of just show. The Muslim Empire at its greatest was essentially bigger than even the Roman Empire. This stretched from the edges of India all the way up into portions of southeast Europe and also the Iberian Peninsula, again, Portugal and Spain. So they had control of all that, North Africa and obviously the Middle East at its height. Over time, as other Muslim groups would take control, those borders, so to speak, would fluctuate. And so we have specifically, as it involves what we're going to be talking about, the Ottoman Empire at generally at its height. That's what we have here in this map. As you can see, Israel obviously still being controlled, and the Ottoman Empire had control of all that. Saudi Arabia would always kind of fluctuate for the Ottoman Empire. They always had conflict there of trying to get full influence and control on it, sometimes not. There's a lot of geopolitical infighting that has happened in the Middle East. Honestly, just like it kind of says in prophecy all the way back in Genesis, the fact that amongst Ishmaelites and so on and so forth, there would be infighting. Well, you have that, not just amongst the Ishmaelites, but the Edomites and so on and so forth. All the various biblical subgroups and their descendants, that's been a thing. But that said, generally under the Caliphate, the Muslim Empire, the Ottoman Empire, which was based in Turkey, would eventually have control of it. And they would retain control of the Muslim Empire until the end of World War I. All right. I got another one here that kind of shows the general loss of territory that would happen to the Ottoman Empire leading up to the beginning of World War I. You can see the different colorations there, the territory that they lost in the early 1800s, then by the time you get to the end of the 1800s, so on and so forth. Just to give you a visual context, the Ottoman Empire was very much in decline by the time we get to 1900, for sure. So, with that, that gives you an idea of what the area looked like and who was in control there. And we're going to be talking a lot about that over today. That said, I want to go ahead and kind of establish a picture here of kind of the social context of the 1800s. All right? By the time you get to the 1800s, the world was very much changing, all right, as it kind of always does, but it was changing at a much faster rate. By the end of the 1700s, you've already had the Industrial Revolution, which was kicking very much into gear in the Western world and would forever change the way the whole world lives. We're talking massive social change and upheaval. The urban city was becoming more and more the mainstay of human society. And agriculture as a way of living, or as a way of many people having their means of life, was starting to go to the wayside. All right? Urbanization was very much what was happening. And slowly and steadily, that became more and more endangered. Concurrent to this, you had during that time, right before the 1800s, the Age of Enlightenment. This was very much part of what would affect the Industrial Revolution. But when you talk about philosophy, theology, political theory, political science, all those kind of things, the Enlightenment had a massive impact on that for specifically the Western world. And again, this would affect the whole world overall. There was very much a turmoil with all this. Revolutions. This is where you get the United States of America and the American Revolution. You get the Haitian Revolution, the French Revolution. I could continue. All these are birthed out of Enlightenment ideas. Again, a lot of social change happens as a result of all this. As it involves specifically Jews and whatnot in Europe, especially Western Europe, they, going into the 1800s, were finding themselves with newfound freedoms, you could say. All right, England had Jews exiled for a long time, had finally did essentially an Emancipation Act of sorts and allowed Jews to come back into the land of England, Britain. A lot of Western Europe was due to ideas of Enlightenment, ideas of progressiveness, ideas of equality and things like that, even if they were still what we consider today minuscule, were having this kind of impact. And so Jews in the Western Europe in particular were finding themselves now not so much, dealing with so much persecution. If you remember from when we did our church history, where we're looking specifically at the church and specifically the Western church, by the time we got to that time, we saw how much literal, every few decades, persecution Jews were going through throughout the world in general, but we were focusing on Europe. Well, at this time, at the beginning of the 1800s, that was kind of being pushed to the wayside. And so there was this, with that came a new a fervor of culture as well within Judaism. And next to all that, like I was saying with everything else, we have all these other things that are happening. You have the beginnings of Karl Marx, Darwin, and his theories and things, and how that would change so much and influence so many things. With the Enlightenment period came a heavy dose of secularization of culture, not just specific to, let's say, Judaism, but Christianity. Anything that was part of the core within Western society was having this effect on it. And yet, it's also in this that you have Friedrich Nietzsche, a famous philosopher who coined the word and term, God is dead. If you guys have heard that term, that's where it comes from, him. That was all this stuff was happening in the 1800s. And even with this, you still had some vestiges of heavy religious movement. You had the Great Awakening that was happening in the United States, specifically, and it kind of spread out to England. And it's in that you have this religious fervor that kind of pushed back against the seesaw that was happening, right? The seesaw of secularization. It's within that context, starting in the 1700s and up, that you also have, especially amongst a lot of American pastors. All right, so this is pre-Darby. If anyone thinks and knows about dispensationalism, they've probably heard ideas that, how people look at Israel has a lot to do with dispensationalism. Before dispensationalism, before any of that, you have pastors like Jonathan Edwards, Charles Spurgeon, great, amazing, big-name pastors. I can give you guys a list of many, many others. Many of who themselves were either not even, premillennial in their eschatological view, but were amillennial or postmillennial, but themselves testified to the reality of what they were seeing when they looked at the Bible and said, God's not done with Israel. Something's going to happen. You got people saying this in the 1600s, the 1700s. With the Great Awakening, you had a lot of that fervor as well. That's important because as it involves some sects of Christianity that has an impact when we get to modern Israel and some of the support and or help they would end up getting. But as this period of secular enlightenment and progressive thought and revolution, it was often violent. There was an old basic sentiment underneath all that, underneath the revolutions and everything else, that still lingered and would eventually find new life in the new enlightened intellectual realm. And that sentiment, that lingering sentiment, was of the anti-Jewish type. And it was brewing slowly during the 1800s. It was the tried and true idea, right? Somehow, some way, it was always find itself into whatever new thing was beginning to happen. And amongst the intellectual elites, that was definitely something that was growing. So, it's also during this time that the beginnings of something called Reformed Judaism, as we know it today, started to develop in Central Europe. Again, as very much a I would say, negative reaction to the Enlightenment period. We have the secularization of a group of Judaism. If you know anything about Reformed theology, Reformed Jewish theology in its modern time today, it is kind of more or less the equivalent of the progressive or liberal Christian church, all right, with pro-LGBTQ and so on and so forth. That specific aspect didn't start at that time, but it would develop into that. They kind of set this route of secularization of Judaism. Pulling, it's hard to say who influenced who, but just like within Christianity at this time, there was a lot of new levels of allegorization happening within the Christian church amongst their theologians, especially in Central Europe, which again, that itself would lead to the eventual progressive Christianity. Same thing was happening in Judaism, and so that's kind of where we get that from. They very much sought to de-emphasize, I think I spelled that wrong, de-emphasize the idea of a physical people of Israel. Part of that was because they thought that would help, some, not all, thought that would help with the idea of, hey, you don't have to think of us as a people to hate. We're just another faith and whatnot. Like, just pull those two things apart. It's this idea of hating us as a people. It's not like that. We're not just a people. We're more than that. And so it's okay. You don't have to be just a Jewish person to be Jewish. And again, some can say there's some truth to that, but there was emphasis there because of the history of the persecution. Very much sought to modernize the faith in and of itself. Maybe not a bad thing when you think of how ultra-Orthodox was, but again, to the other extreme, and eventually even further as we get in today's time. Very much they wanted to be accepted by the world. That was a big part of it, again, because of the persecution that had happened in the past. So as you have the Enlightenment, and you have this allegorization of how the scholars and whatnot looked at the Bible, this was affecting Christianity, this was affecting Judaism, it was a thing across the board. All right, so we're going to go ahead and start looking at the Holy Land during the 1800s. Let's pull that back up over here. So, as we had shown with some of those maps, it was already under Muslim rule, the Ottomans in particular, and the land more or less had kind of remained desolate. You did have easily somewhere in the realm, based off various censuses that have been taken during that time, of 2 to maybe 400,000 people living in the area. Some of them nomadic, some of them the Bedouins, so they kind of roamed around. And this is in reference to the whole land altogether, and that includes what they would call, the region was called Palestine. And we know why they have that name. We've talked about that before, as a result of the Roman occupation and them changing the name. But in any case, there in the land, the Holy Land area, it was mostly Arabs, for sure. You did have Christians, a minority of Christians. You had the even smaller minority of a group called the Druze. That's going to come into play later on, especially in our third portion of the series. And you have, obviously, some Jews as well. Contrary to popular belief, sometimes how we overgeneralize things in the faith and whatnot, and whether it be in church or even in the congregations of Messianic flavor, there have always been Jews in the land, even during exile. A very, very small amount. We're talking families, clans, max size. We're not talking, we're not talking hundreds of thousands or anything like that. But there have always been Jews in the land, even after the Roman exile, because some would always kind of move back. You had a Jewish presence in Jerusalem, in some of the towns. There were a couple towns like Hebron, which were almost majority Jewish, Very small village. We're not talking like Kernersville or anything like that. We're talking like village style towns. Okay, so there was always a little bit of that there. In any case, Christians, Jews, were considered a protected class, usually under the Caliphate, the Muslim Empire. But this meant that they were second-class citizens, and they had to pay a tax called the Jiza. I'm not pronouncing that right. Forgive me. It's Jizya, if you want to look it up. That's a tax they had to pay as a second-class citizen. And it was very much a way of saying, hey, you're protected under us. We accept you under us, but know that you are under us. It was a means of that, all right? And this would happen to both Christians and Jews who were under Muslim rule and or territory. That said, there is, and you know, I've said this myself, but to give it context, you've probably heard, and you've heard me say it, that generally speaking, under Muslim rule, Jews had it better overall than they did under Christian rule in Europe in medieval times and so on and so forth. And that is true. However, I have realized, and I think I've made this mistake too, of saying that without giving it proper context. That's a very low bar to get above. All right? What do I mean by that? There was still heavy persecution that happened under Muslim rule, as it involved Jews and Christians for that matter. Pogroms that would happen. Would it happen to the same maybe overall fervor or extent that happened within Christian Europe or other Christian-ruled areas? Definitely not. But when you're talking about something that happens every few decades over here and say it's better over here, again, that's a low bar to get above. And to give you just a few examples, we have the 8th century Morocco, where we had massacres against specifically Jews. 1033 in Fez, Morocco. Again, we had massacres and burning of synagogues as it involved Jews under Muslim rule. 1066 in Granada, Spain. This was probably one of the worst ones, where you had somewhere in the range of about 5,000 Jews were slaughtered under Muslim rule. This is when the Muslim Empire had Spain and Portugal. There were sometimes exiles. Example here, the exile in Yemen in 1680. Didn't last too long. As it so happens, in most places, when they kick out the Jews, things don't always go well. This has a lot to do with that. This is, for the people who deny this aspect of the cursing and the blessing as it involves Israel, when you read that in Genesis and when you read that in Numbers, because it's repeated in Numbers in reference to the nation, not just the idea of just Abraham's seeds or seed, there isn't a stipulation that you got to be a good or bad person. There isn't a stipulation that you got to be a believer in God. Those who bless Israel get blessed. It's not a salvation thing. Those who curse Israel get cursed. It's not a salvation thing. It can be a part of that if depending on where you are with God and whatnot, for sure, or it's an example or an outworking of where a person is with God. But any people group who has ever come against Israel, we looked at this before, has always suffered bad effects at some point as a result, whether themselves getting wiped out, as we saw throughout many times in the Bible, or as history has shown, looking at what Rome did, what would eventually happen to the Romans, looking at what various Christian empires did in Europe and what happened to them, especially when you get to bubonic plague and things like that. We're going to see later on what happened to the British Empire after some things they did. We're going to see that when we get specifically into the second one. Well, when they did this in Yemen, that area started to suffer heavily, and eventually they said, hey, come back, because we realized things were better. When they came back, things got better. It's just the reality. It's the blessing and the curse that God talked about. In any case, as you can see, again, this is not a full list. It'd be a lot, and still not as much as within Christian-controlled areas. But the point I'm trying to make with this is that it's not as if Jews had it perfectly in peace and never had any issues under Muslim rule. That's a fallacy. Again, it's a low bar to get above to say that they were overall better than the Christian world was. They were, but it's in and of itself doesn't say a whole lot. We have a historian whose quote I wanted to utilize. If you can read it. If not, I'm going to read it out loud for y'all. The situation of the Jews in the Arab lands reached a low point in the 19th century. All right? Jews in most of North Africa, including Algeria, 19th century, just so you know, is the 1800s. Jews in most of North Africa, including Algeria, Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, and Morocco, were forced to live in ghettos. In Morocco, which contained the largest Jewish community in the Islamic diaspora, Jews were made to walk barefoot or wear shoes of straw when outside the ghetto. Even Muslim children participated in the degradation of Jews by throwing stones at them or harassing them in other ways. The frequency of anti-Jewish violence increased, and many Jews were executed on charges of apostasy. Ritual murder accusations against the Jews became commonplace in the Ottoman Empire. Ritual murder accusations. We talked about that when we did the church history thing. The blood libel. The idea that Jews were, in Europe, they were killing Christians during Passover to use their blood to make matzah. Well, eventually those ideas did spread into Middle East and Muslim rule. They kind of started the same stuff. They got that from the Christians, by the way. But yeah. Continues here. So, again, this is, in many ways, the context in which, again, Zionism would start to develop. Hundreds of years of persecution wherever they went. A new heightened rise that we're going to be looking at of anti-Semitism in the 1800s in Europe. And that's something we're going to look at because that had a massive influence on the man who would be Theodor Herzl. And the idea that the Jew could only be safe in a Jewish society began to take hold because they had always been under the thumb of somebody else, essentially, for a long time at this point. It is during this time that a growing desire amongst many of Jewish people of thoughts, be they rabbis or intellectual thinkers and so on and so forth, started to have this desire of saying, hey, we kind of need to go back to the land. And the decades before Theodor Herzl, again, the guy who's considered the father of Zionism, they already had many writers and thinkers who were starting to speak of a return to the land for the Jewish people. I got a few here. Avraham Mapu, Moses Hess, Leon Pinkster. There are many more. Those are a few if you want to look some up. And a theme you notice with some of these guys in particular is that they were starting to have a healthy, I would say, dose of skepticism about the general peace that Jews were having in mainly Western Europe, and Europe in a general sense. And they felt that they themselves were seeing a dark tide simmering beneath the surface. So it is with this that eventually you would get the first Aliyah. Again, this predates Theodor Herzl. This predates the official Zionist movement, so to speak. The first Aliyah was in 1880. It was a combination mainly. There were others, but the majority of this particular group, the major demographics were Russian and Yemenite Jews. Again, this starts before Herzl has even begun to think of doing anything or has had quote-unquote Zionist thoughts. It would actually be a few years after this or into this that he would have his journey where he starts to go on that area. But in any case, due to various persecutions that were happening in Russia and in Yemen, some of these Jews started to say, hey, let's go to the land. There were a lot of Jews, especially from Russia, who didn't even do that. They went to the United States or to England. But yeah, so this is the first Aliyah. It starts in 1880 and kind of lasts for the next decade plus, all right, of movement. A good, well over 50, probably somewhere in the range of 60% of these Jews who would go to the Holy Land would eventually leave. It was desolate. To go there wasn't a lot of usable land. There wasn't a lot of land for agriculture. There obviously was barely any, if none. There was almost non-existent urbanization. And so, especially for Jews who were coming from Russia, or later on Jews who'd come from Europe, that was a shock, right? Most of the Jews who would stay there were going to end up being the Yemenite Jews from this particular group. But yeah, I mean, to go to that land was going to be hard work. Not everybody was going to be cut out for it regardless. But with all this happening, it's around this time, a little bit after, that you have Theodor Herzl, who comes. He was from what was considered a conservative Jewish family. He fell in a lot with the general secularization of Europe, as of many Jews of his time would start to, okay? And again, in Europe, same thing with Christianity, for that matter. He adored many of the intellectual elites of his time during this time of intellectual upheaval. You had conferences that were happening. You had the beginning of what would eventually grow to be the big science festivals that became world-renowned, and intellectual elites that would go into the early 1900s and whatnot. These things were developing in Europe at this time. Again, a continuation of that Enlightenment mentality that had happened in the century before and leading into this one. However, in these circles, even some of the ones that he considered his personal heroes, he started to notice in their writings things that seemed rather derogatory in reference to the Jewish people. It kind of bugged him, but he was like, maybe it's a misunderstanding, maybe it's whatever. He ended up going to a conference in Italy to meet with a lot of people with that. He also went to a school there. And it was at this place that he saw the conversation lead into massive anti-Semitism and the intellectual ideas of, again, bringing up the Jewish problem, the Jewish question as it was known in medieval Europe. What do you do with the Jews? He was shocked. This was the intellectual elite. These were the progressives. These were the people who had gotten past such, old ways of thinking. But it was with that Herzl had a realization. If this is happening in the intellectual elites, and intellectual elite ideas always trickle down, what will happen when these ideas come back down to the layman? And with that, he had this epiphany that something's afoot, and we need to be ready for it. And he started to realize what was happening. Because again, in a lot of Central and Western Europe, again, Jews might have been having a general good time, but in Eastern Europe, not so much, actually. There were still things that were happening. Pogroms here and there were happening, small scale, but starting to grow. I think I showed you guys this quote before. I'm going to do it again, though. Herzl, in reference to all this, says that the Jewish question persists wherever Jews live in appreciable numbers. Wherever it does not exist, it is brought in together with Jewish immigrants. In other words, if there's an area where there's not really anti-Semitism, and Jews flock there because it's like, oh, hey, it's pretty good there, let's go. Well, it always follows them. It's only a matter of time, within a generation or so, that then that new area that was generally peaceful now all of a sudden had anti-Semitic ideas going around, slurs, so on and so forth. It was always a matter of time. This was, again, we looked at that. That was the story of them everywhere they went in Europe. We looked at that before. In any case, he continues. We are naturally drawn into those places where we are not persecuted, and our appearance there gives rise to persecution. This is the case and will inevitably be so everywhere, even in highly civilized countries. See, for instance, France, so long as the Jewish question is not solved on the political level. When he says, see, in instance, France, he says this, puts this out there right after a particular Jewish person, whose name I forget, who was a part of, I think it was the government or the military, and there was essentially a thing that happened, and they used this guy as a scapegoat. They would eventually oh my gosh, sorry, I'm a little tired. Yes, that was him. But they would eventually, Dreyfus, they would eventually, what's the word I'm looking for? Renounce or say they were wrong about this, but the damage had already been done by using him as a scapegoat. And the feeling was very much that he was used as a scapegoat because he was a Jew. And so Herzl, that's specifically what he was referencing when he talks about France right here. Very much the idea is that as long as they are, the Jews, under the mercy of Gentiles, non-Jewish people, wherever they go, they are exactly that, at the mercy of those who are at best apathetic to their plight and situation, or at worst, those who themselves are persecuting them via pogroms or other things. So Herzl, and like I said, at this time you already have ideas amongst many Jews of what either return to the land or just in general finding a way to get away from all this. Herzl was more pragmatic in that he said the best way to do this is for us to have some type of political entity that we are in charge of, so that we are no longer under somebody else, because nobody else will look for our welfare the best way that we will. That was the mentality. And to be fair, he wasn't wrong. All right? That's what gives birth to a Zionism specific to the idea of a political state. So he actually went to one of the Rothschilds, Baron Abraham Edmund Benjamin, a Rothschild of France. I know there's a lot of people out there like, oh, the Rothschilds, conspiracy theories, and this, that, and the other. Well, before Herzl ever even met this guy, this particular Rothschild, because, yes, there was more than one. There are different groups of Rothschilds. He was from the French branch, so to speak. He was actually one of the major funders of that first Aliyah, the one that had a lot of the Russian and Yemenite Jews. He helped them buy land in the Holy Land from Arabs who were there. He helped them build things like that. He invested heavily in that. He was a big philanthropist. Yeah. Thank you, philanthropist. I'm tired, guys. Forgive me. It's been a long week. In any case, he was very much that. Herzl comes to him with his idea. He rejected Herzl. A lot of people don't know that because they think the Rothschilds were behind all, because of the conspiracies and everything else. Anybody who's rich tends to not be liked in the world. This is just the reality. Herzl actually, he rejected Herzl, mainly because he didn't like the idea of working on a political entity. Herzl tried to convince him of that, and again, my opinion, Herzl was definitely had the right view there, as we would see in the future, but Edmund didn't agree with that. He actually thought that would be a bad idea. It might make things worse for Jews around the world, and there's also, there's probably truth to that as well. In any case, he essentially rejected helping him, all right? Later on, when we get to the League of Nations, after World War I, this particular Rothschild actually, in a letter to the League of Nations, in reference to, at the time it was beginning to happen with the potential realization of a Jewish state, himself said the struggle to put an end to the wandering Jew could not have as its result the creation of a wandering Arab. Again, this particular Rothschild wasn't very much in favor of that version of Zionism. I'm sure by now you've noticed I've said version of Zionism a couple times, or implied Zionisms, plural, just like when we talked about before, Judaism's plural, same thing, all right? So you have Zionisms, plural. From the first Zionist Congress, which would happen in 1889 on, there was a lively debate that would continue to happen about what Zionism would be, what it was, how it would work, and what it should even focus on. There were those who would want a political state. There were those who were, regardless of whether they wanted a political state or not, were more focused on the cultural entity or identity of what this would be. Some who were more focused on the spiritual aspects of what this would be. Some of them who were so focused on that stuff, they actually thought, hey, a political state should even be within the view right now, if at all. But they were Zionist. Yeah, sometimes when we hear Zionism, we think, and in fairness, especially with modern Zionists today, we think only in terms of a political state. The reality is there were many who were a part of this group who weren't even very fond of that idea. There was a debate, constant debate about what this would be. You guys have heard it said ad nauseum at this point from me. You put 5 Jews in a room, you're going to get 10 opinions or more. That's just the reality. That's what would happen. And these debates sometimes got heated, very heated. And that's important to know because sometimes we focus in on certain individuals who were Zionists and certain things that they said, bad things, and assume that that was representative of the whole, not realizing that their ideas or opinions sometimes were the minority and were sometimes actually rejected by the whole. But people will focus on that because they were a Zionist. So let's quote them, right? This is, anyone who knows American history, the United States history, it's the same thing in the United States. Listen, when we won the War of Independence, we didn't have the United States of America within the next few years. It would be a couple decades before you had the Constitution as we know it, before you had anything like the United States as we know it, which itself would continue to evolve and change over the next century. There was debate. There was a constant infighting. Some of the founding fathers, as brilliant as some of these guys were, if you read the histories, by the end of all this, some of them hated each other's guts. They did not all get along, varying ideas of what United States would be, what would be this entity. Same thing was happening with this, all right? So it's very easy sometimes to quote individuals and not realizing that they didn't represent the whole, or to forget to look to see if the whole accepted what individuals said. And there's a lot of that, because there are some Zionists who said some very terrible things. And we'll get to that a little bit more later. But they were definitely not representative of the whole thing. So to give you a few names of people who, in a sense, can kind of be representative of various concepts of Zionism. You have Balak, Aham, you have Ziv. I like to call him Ziv. That's usually how I refer to him. You got people like Rabbi, a religious guy. I know people are like, there was no religious Zionists. There were. Rabbi Kook, Abraham Isaac Kook, and Rabbi Jacob Meyer. These guys, in many ways, kind of can be, and again, this is a very generalized statement here, representative of various streams of Zionism. Obviously, as involves the bottom two, a more spiritual and religious take on Zionism. Definitely the minority within that time, but as time has shown, their seeds of Zionism, their concepts have won out because Israel has only grown more religious over the decades since it became a state. You have people like Ziv. He's an interesting one, and he's one we're going to look at later on for sure. He was very much maybe overly pragmatic and had a very much ends justify the means mentality. He himself would end up organizing militias in Israel leading up to 1948. There's some aspects of that that would end up being a good thing and helpful, but there were definitely things that he brought about that weren't good, as it involves some of the Arab population in the areas, how he would allow them to be treated, despite the fact that, interesting man, despite the fact that he himself said that we need a state that will treat both Arab and Jew equal. But again, his view of the ends justify the means at any cost type thing would come to haunt Israel for sure. I'll say this right now real quick. I'll mention it again later. Later on, David Ben-Gurion, who would be the prime minister of Israel in the first one, wouldn't allow him to be buried in Israel. Again, like I said, the heated stuff that would happen, in part because of things that happened as a result of this man. I get it, where he was coming from. He would eventually, decades later, be allowed. There would be petitions and whatnot, but essentially David Ben-Gurion said, over my dead body. And it wouldn't be until after he died that it was allowed. So you have, let's see here, let me get that up. Okay, yeah. So you have in this various, again, ways of thinking of how, again, especially the how we should even come to a state, what ways to do it. Some of them were more militant for sure. Some of them were saying, no, let's just focus on the culture, build that up, and eventually a state might grow out of it. And again, some who just didn't even want a state to begin with. A lot of debate, a lot of that was going on there. In reference to the accusation that all of it was secular, again, you even see some rabbis here, and there were more than just these couple. But in particular, Rabbi Cook made a mention of this in reference to the fact that there was a highly secular population within the Zionist movement. He said, in reference to them, that they were filled with love, justice, and power. The task of rabbis was to bring them to self-awareness rather than seeking to stifle these young people. Spiritual leaders should be empowering them precisely via the Torah that they, these youth, earnestly and even sometimes justifiably despised. And why did he say that? You guys, when I had last spoke a little bit on this, Haim Balik, I had told you about him. He wrote in reference to a pogrom that happened in Kishinev over in Russia. Where it was a very bad program. Hundreds of Jews were killed and slaughtered. Women were raped and so on and so forth. He himself had made a mention that in reference to again, when we think Orthodox Judaism today, that's not even enough. You got to think ultra-Orthodox Judaism today is what we're talking about when we say Orthodox Judaism back then. He had made a mention that the men, after seeing their wives raped, would walk over their bodies to the rabbis and ask them, is she still good for me? Now, he was a poet. He might have been exaggerating that point. But the point he was trying to make was they were so, the Orthodox Jews were so worried with religious minutia and ritual that life in front of them hurt and hurt, they weren't even paying attention to. And we talked about this before. I made a mention of how, isn't that kind of similar to some of the accusations that Yeshua had in reference to some of the religious leadership of his time? Same thing. And so when he says here that they even justify, he's making reference mainly to that. He had a realization that, hey, we've probably gone too far on religious minutia and ritual to the point where we don't focus enough on the life of a person and the well-being of a person. And he realized, this particular rabbi was very much of the idea of, our secular brothers are realizing this. They're not wrong, and we need to help them with that, to see that, hey, you're not wrong, but still, our spiritual reality is the right thing to go for. Again, over time, this would win out. In the beginning, maybe not so much. There was definitely some spiritual and religious Zionists there, but it was definitely the minority for sure. So it is after these first few congresses that the Zionist Congress would have, where they'd bring various Zionist Jews who were about this idea and wanted to try to make this a reality, you eventually get the second Aliyah. Leading up right before this, Herzl would end up dying. Not long, right around the beginning of when this particular movement of Jews would happen. He would die not long after this proposal was of Uganda. Some of the powers in Europe said, hey, maybe we can help you guys get a state, but it ain't going to be over there. Mainly because, well, Europe didn't have any control over there. It was the Ottomans who had control. And some of them were like, hey, maybe we can do this for you because of all these things that are happening in Kishinev and other things. They said, you guys can have Uganda. Herzl didn't like the idea. He went to the Zionist Congress. They had a heated debate about it. He didn't think they would agree. They didn't. Well, a lot of them were like, no, because the whole point is for us to go to the land. If we go here, it's not to our homeland. Some of them even proposed Argentina, by the way, just because there was a large Jewish group over there, funny enough. In any case, it would be within the year after that Herzl would die. So a lot of people say of sadness, because if I remember, it was a heart attack or something along those lines. He probably felt like he failed. Little did he know what would continue to happen in the decades after. In any case, with his death, we have around that time the second Aliyah. This one's really big because it's here that you get the kibbutz, as a lot of people sometimes hear or think about with Israel. That's when the first kibbutz was founded. You had a lot more, especially as involved a political idea, socialist and communist Jews who were going over there, Jews from various areas where socialism and communism was heavy. And they were making these little kibbutzes, these little small-scale villages where that's how they kind of ran their particular village. Everything was shared, everything was, think of it like the communist idea of an actual utopia, which, when you have a small village, you could probably make work, obviously on grander scales, not so much as history has shown, but regardless of that, you also have the revival of the Hebrew language en masse. During this time, many of some of the scholars and intellectual elites that were going over there were establishing a university. The Hebrew University that's in Israel today was founded during this time. You also have the arrival of none other than David Ben-Gurion. So he's going to be very important. He ends up becoming the first prime minister. He's, in many ways, a George Washington-esque figure for Israel. All right? And during all of this stuff and everything we've been talking about, there was, funny enough, a movement of believing Jews, by that I mean Jews believing in Yeshua, that was happening also within Judaism throughout all this little batch of time. The 1800s actually saw a rise in this, even if it was still very small. And even if some of these Jews, still were fighting with the idea of where the Torah belongs in the life of a Jew, but you also had others who were developing the reality of, wait a minute, the Torah isn't really done away with, despite how Christianity puts it. This is a small list of various ones to look at. It's even bigger than this. I would suggest, if you want, take a picture and look up some of these with their dates of when they were living. This was in and around the beginnings and during and even after the beginnings of Zionism, again. And I put this up there because I talked about it a few weeks back when we had that teaching, the sermon I did. What % of Israel needs to be following God for God to still bless them? We've looked at this before when we talk about even how in ancient Israel, northern Israel, started as an apostate state, but God still considered it his. He sent prophets to them to warn them. He still dealt with them. He still treated them as his children. When the northern kingdom started as an apostate state, in my opinion, way worse than a secular state. An apostate state seeks to go against God. A secular state is at best neutral. Can be a little bit worse, sure, but even with all this, and this is something I've been researching more and more of the last year of my particular interest, is there was a growing, you could say almost the seeds of modern messianic movement was growing during this time. There were whole groups, some of you know of Joseph Rabinowitz, who himself would found a fairly large congregation in Eastern Europe, Western Russia. A lot of this was beginning to happen. The more I've researched this, the more I am coming to the opinion that the Holocaust and World War II on a spiritual level, was very much a attempt to stop this, to stop a believing Jewish remnant from growing. Because a lot of the groups that these people would start, some of their congregations they would have, by the time you get to the Holocaust, disappear. And kind of essentially stalled what would become a messianic movement in its fullness as we get into the 60s and 70s within Israel, of believing Jews in Yeshua. I'm coming to that personal opinion. That is an opinion of mine. But yeah, in any case, I wanted to showcase this because this is happening during that time. And some of those Jews that would even start within Israel in the very beginning were believers in Yeshua, even if it was only a small amount, very, very small amount, handfuls. So, where are we on the time? I think I can finish this. Let's see. Getting to the really juicy part. So, coming into World War I, all right? You have the world on fire, a war which, my personal opinion, I'm not sure that we can say there was really fully a good and bad side in the same way that we would, let's say, with World War II. In any case, the Ottoman Empire sided with Austria-Hungary and Germany, the Central Axis as they were called, and England, France heavily took advantage of that as it came to attacking the Ottomans, and eventually it would lead to the complete dismantleization of the Ottoman Empire. Then the Caliphate, the Muslim Caliphate, which had been around at that point for well over 1,000 years, fell apart. It has not been in existence since, although there's been many attempts to restart it. The Ottomans committed what is considered the first genocide of the 1900s, which was the Armenian genocide. They killed some 1.5 million Christian Armenians. They specifically targeted them and killed them in the span of just a couple years. England and France would, by the end of this war, take over much of the Middle East and kind of carve it amongst themselves. Various regions with Arabs would lobby for independence, all right? Because a lot of them didn't want to be under the Ottomans by this point anyway. But now that Europe had taken over, a lot of them were like, okay, we helped. A lot of them sided with, let's say, England and whatnot, or France, to fight the Ottomans with the expectation that they were going to be given their own independence. This is something that happens all the time. This happened with the United States and the Philippines in World War II. This is a thing that happens all the time. Sometimes countries keep their promises, sometimes they don't. Or sometimes it gets even more complicated because in this particular case, England was making promises to Arabs. It was also making promises to the Jews in the Holy Land as well. This would come back to bite England in the butt heavily on a political level. Because obviously the Jews in the Holy Land during this time are doing the same. Ziev, the guy I told you about who's making militia groups, himself actually made some militia groups to help England fight against the Ottoman Empire. He himself would be exiled by the Ottomans, but would continue working against them, helping to provide information for England and whatnot. Very more militaristic and that kind of guy. It is in the aftermath of this, or actually still, funny enough, as World War I is still happening, but just near the very end of it, you get what's called the Balfour Declaration from England. The famed Balfour Declaration is where England in particular agreed to the creation of a homeland for the Jews in Palestine. All right? This was before the full victory of World War I, so you gotta kind of imagine that's a pretty confident thing to do, because it's like, we haven't even won this yet. We haven't even really taken this over yet. But you know what? We're going to do this for you. You can imagine that probably set some people in the land, specifically the Arabs and Muslims, especially of the more Ottoman side, in flame a little bit, understandably. The announcement was sent in a letter to Walter Rothschild, not the same Rothschild that we talked about earlier. This is in England, a different Rothschild. And in this declaration, they said that they would make a homeland for Israel. Now, here's the funny thing. This would later be kind of contradicted by what's called the White Paper, or White Paper policies by England within the next, barely a decade. But here's the funny thing. As it involves the Balfour Declaration, the actual letter, it's not long, it's like a paragraph, doesn't actually say a whole lot outside of a general promise. It's rather vague in the specifics on the what this would look like, the how this would look like. There were no maps, no definitions of territory. It was a very general promise. And it kind of, in my opinion, on a geopolitical level, I think was one of those things, again, kind of like they did with some of the Arabs. Help us fight the Ottomans. This is what we're going to do for you. You get where I'm going? I think there was more of that involved there than there was really anything else. And again, the Jews did help fight the Ottomans as a result, because they were like, hey, they're going to help us get this, especially a lot of the Zionist Jews. So when England would eventually take over the land, this is what it would look like. This is called the Mandate for Palestine, British Mandate. I'll have you note, Palestine is a lot more than just the land of Israel in this very beginning, all right? You have what would eventually be Jordan, all right, the Kingdom of Jordan, which is all this over here, and then eventually what would be the modern state of Israel, which is really just everything to the west of the Jordan River and the Dead Sea and whatnot, the Sea of Galilee and all. But this is what the British would take of that area. And it was from this that they would eventually say, hey, from this is what we'll make a homeland over the next decade, the discussions they would have back and forth. There's going to be a lot of tribal geopolitics that gets involved at this point. Because while the British Mandate has this, England also, had whole portions of Arabia. You had the French who had what is today Syria, Lebanon. The British had Iraq, portions of Egypt, which was much more easily given back over to allow for an Egyptian full authority there. There was a lot of that stuff happening, and everybody and their mama wanted a piece of the Holy Land, okay? And so this is the beginnings of what's going to cause a lot of conflict. Getting into the third aliyah, this was very much, in many ways, a continuation of the second one. It's just that once World War I started, the ability for people to go freely moving around to the areas that were under massive war was kind of hard, right? Makes sense. Well, it is in this, though, that the Russian Revolution, which is when Russia fell to communism at the end of towards the end of World War I, that almost some 200,000 Jews were targeted and killed. Again, that escalation that Herzl and others like him were seeing rise was now becoming to get to a point where it got to full steam, all right? 200,000 Jews killed in Russia. So you can imagine a massive wave of immigration both to the United States of Russian Jews and to the Holy Land of Russian Jews, which was now under British control. However, during this time, also, Britain puts in quotas of how much Jews they will allow into the Holy Land. This goes into the 20s, into the 30s. If I remember right, the number was somewhere in the range of, I think it was 70,000 a year was all they were going to allow. It might have been a little less than that, but it was somewhere around there where they capped that. And it's during this time that now you have a movement amongst a lot of the Zionist Jews is saying, whoa, look what just happened in Russia with all these Jews killed, and they're seeing the rise of someone like Hitler who just wrote Mein Kampf, all right, in the 20s and whatnot. And they're freaking out because they're like, guys, something's really about to happen. We need people over here. We need to get them over here. We need to get them out of Europe. Something's happening. Something's coming. And so there's a bigger push for that. England does what they do with the stifling of the control of population, of immigration, both because of the Arab lobbyists that were there. And again, I can understand some of that. The Arab lobbyists were like, no, we don't want more Jews coming over here because we're seeing now the beginnings of the potential of them actually getting a state, them getting something. The more we're over here, the easier that can be, the more easily that can be a reality. So they were lobbying British to not allow that. So the British at this point is now like trying to play both sides a little bit on a political level. They're making promises to the Jews, Zionist Jews, Jews who are in the Middle East, but they're also making promises to the Arabs. And the reality is both these promises can't be kept without breaking the other one. And that is a reality that was beginning to happen there. It's during this time that we have the rise of a particular Arab. All right? This, I'm going to preface with something. Just this week, just so happens, I think it was this week, Netanyahu made reference to this person. He said some things that weren't true. And so before I really get into the fullness of this, I just want to say there was no Arab, there was no Muslim, there was no any person from outside of Europe who influenced Hitler to his genocidal maniac designs. All right? Netanyahu, if I understood right, I haven't verified it, but my understanding is he put something out like this, so just to get ahead of that, just to say, the person I'm about to go over did not influence Hitler to go and kill a bunch of Jews. Hitler was already about that and wanted to do that before this person talked to him. Okay? The person we're going to talk about is Hajj Amin al-Husani. He was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. So again, I want to state that out there. That is not true. I don't care if Netanyahu says that, a rabbi says that, a pastor says it. I don't care. This guy did not get Hitler to do that. Hitler was already going to do that regardless. There was no Arab influence on Hitler's Holocaust. Okay? Whoa. Cutting it close here. Let's see. So this particular guy, though, did have meetings with Hitler. He would become a political and religious lead of the Muslim Arabs in the Holy Land. Although for sure probably wasn't representative of all of them, and we're going to talk about that a little later. But in any case, he would be the leader of something called the Arab Higher Committee. Wow, I can't speak. Committee. And he started revolts against British colonial control and also their general Zionist support. This guy would go on to meet with Hitler when we get into the 30s, once Hitler had power, especially also during World War II. In particular, he is when he specifically met with him, and the Holocaust was already underway again, so he didn't have anything to do with that. But before getting to that little detail, I want to make note of the political entity that he was a part of in the land, the Holy Land, called the Arab Higher Committee. Why am I focusing in on that? There's the idea that the Palestinians as a quote-unquote Palestinian people were in existence at this time. No such thing. It was an Arab people. Even in reference to themselves, they call themselves Arabs. The idea of a specific Palestinian people, even amongst them, does not exist. Was the place called Palestine because of that general region name that had been given to it for this time over 1,000 years or whatnot? Yes, of course. But even the people living there didn't call themselves Palestinians. They were considered themselves either Egyptian Arabs, Saudi Arabs. Some of them consider themselves Syrians. Matter of fact, amongst the infighting that was happening within the Arabs of the land, some of them wanted to be part of Syria, and what was called Greater Syria. Some would eventually want it to be part of the Jordanian Arabs. You get where I'm going with this? This idea of Palestinian people, unique in that sense, was not a thing. That wouldn't happen until later on when it became convenient to make it a thing. And it's this guy who would actually lead that development going into the 40s, 50s, and beyond. In any case, this is a picture of him. He himself would meet with Hitler in 1941 and after. There's actually a time where he got exiled and stayed in Germany. He helped them bring propaganda to the Middle East, Nazi propaganda to the Middle East, and you can imagine that that was heavily to do with anti-Jewish, Jewish sentiment. Picture of him meeting with Hitler. He gave general support to the Nazi regime. He collaborated with them on propaganda and actually even helped them with SS recruitment. The SS was the German elite squad. He helped them make a Muslim division of the SS in Bosnia. He didn't help Hitler come up with the idea of the Holocaust, but boy, did he love Hitler's idea of the Holocaust and was hoping that when Hitler would continue to win, as they were at the time, and Europe would eventually be able to bring that influence to the Middle East. Understand that this guy was hoping to bring the Holocaust to the Middle East. Okay? Very much was someone who agreed with Hitler on the extermination of the Jewish people. He actually even made statements along the lines of saying that the German people were a people akin, a friendly akin people for the Arab people because of this anti-Jewish sentiment. Now, does that mean every Arab would have agreed with this? No. No. I'm just making a point that we already are seeing within Arab leadership, specifically Arab leadership within the land, designs of genocidal ideas as it involves Jews. Don't think that that does not have a massive influence on Jews in the land who would learn and or know about this, especially those who have that very pragmatic ends justify the means type. This gets complex. This gets into almost a gray morality, what we're going to end up getting into, where there's a sense where you can almost empathize with certain things even if they were wrong, okay, as it involves some individuals in Israel and what they would do. But I'm going to let this kind of bleed into the next one. Let's see. I got a couple slides here, and we're going to stop. And then we'll kind of pick up on this area when we come together again in about 2 weeks, okay? We will not be meeting next Shabbat for this, but the Shabbat after. All right, so we have what's called the Peel Commission. It was set up in the during the 20s and 30s, specifically the 30s, where there was a commission for seeing about the plausible reality of making a Jewish state, and eventually a Jewish and Arab state was the idea. And I want you to, again, as you look at this, Arab state. This idea of a Palestinian state was not a thing, an Arab state. Mind you, by this time, Jordan has already been separated from the British mandate to be an Arab state, by the way, which is to say easily over 70% of the British mandate was already given over to make an Arab state. It wasn't enough. Fair enough. They want to have some of this portion of the land to still have an Arab state. And again, because there were Arabs living there, I get it. In any case, the Peel Commission came to the realization that, hey, this is a conundrum, because you have Jews who want a state, and they're very fervent about it, but you also have Arabs in the land who want to have their own states, and they're very fervent about it, and we don't really see a way to fully make this work. But they did propose a potential means of partition, because they figured if you kind of split it up, maybe you can have some eventual peace. And so what we have here in that greenish color is what from the Peel Commission was a potentially proposed Jewish state, with everything else being an Arab state, and this little portion right here would stay, which included Jerusalem, would stay under British rule, eventually would transfer over to what would eventually be the UN, was the idea. It would be a international place, not owned by anyone specific, mainly because it did have a lot of holy sites, and they thought maybe that would be better. We can make sure everybody has access to it, so on and so forth. That was the idea from this commission. Eventually, though, what would end up happening, and we're going to overlap with some of this when we meet again next time, is by the end of World War II, by the end of the Holocaust, and no doubt because of the Holocaust and what happened there, a lot of nations had, even if it was only for a moment, some sympathy for the Jewish plight, because it was kind of like, hey, they've been themselves saying and warning about this, and look what happened. Let's throw them this cookie. For a lot of nations, that's how it was. Some nations, because of the especially more democratic ones, because of the political fervor, if only because, hey, a lot of our own people want them to have this, let's do that because I want to get voted in again. There's definitely some of that. That's just the reality, the political reality. Because many of the people that would favor Israel, and we'll talk about this later on, when you get to 1948 and whatnot, also put an arms embargo on Israel as they were attacked by 5 other nations. We're going to talk about that more next time. But the point I'm trying to make there is it wasn't like there was a full agreement even there. But what would end up happening with the UN partition, we're going to start with this one on my right. The UN proposed, England said, hey, you know what, we're done. We're going to give this fully over to the UN. We're going to let you figure this out because we've tried now for a couple decades to figure out the best way to make this work. And nobody seems to be happy about it. Or, specifically, one side will say yes, and the other side says no. All right? And I can tell you right now that the representatives of the Arabs would say no all the time, regardless of if all their population felt that way. And the Jews were always saying, we'll take whatever. Matter of fact, that last one, the Jews said yes to this. Look at the little bit of land they would have had. The Jews said, we'll take it. Even though there was a lot of, by this point, Jewish population in some of these other areas, the Jews says, we'll take it. The Arab committee, the Arab Higher Committee, said no. They would have had, at that point, over 70% of the land if they had just said yes, but they said no. So the UN partition comes up after a few different plans are put together. This is the one that would end up being the one that they agreed to within the UN. The area in the blue, all right, going up, is what they proposed as a Jewish state. And everything else would have been an Arab state, with these little portions of cross lines being essentially a boundaries where both of them connected and allow travel from one to the other. Here's the thing to remember. In Israel, most of this down is the Negev desert. Some people have looked at this and say, look how much land they were going to give them, and it's not fair, blah, blah, blah. This was desert. Even with all the agricultural and boom that Israel had started to have with Jews coming back into the land happening up here, this was still desert down here. And that wasn't exactly a big thing to give to them. But hey, this is what they proposed. The Jews, the Zionist leaders of the Jews, the ones who represented them and whatnot, said, we'll take it. The Arab leadership, who could have had, this is your two-state solution. They could have had that if that's what they wanted. They didn't want it because they didn't want a two-state solution. Any plan that had a Jewish state, no matter how small, no matter how big, was not going to be accepted by Arab leadership. This would continue to be the issue over the next several decades till now, because this has been reproposed in various forms since then, many times by Israel themselves, to a point where Israel themselves even unilaterally try to make it work. We're We're going to talk about that when we get to the third part. But in any case, that's what was proposed. We're going to talk about the war next time we get together, but this was the end result. Where after being invaded by 5 Arab nations, essentially within 24 hours after declaring independence, this would be the end result. The Jews would actually get more than what they had. The Arabs would get less than what they could have had. With this, the Jordanians had what is called today the West Bank, Judea, Samaria. All right? The Gaza Strip was Egypt. You had areas near the Golan Heights that Israel would have, other parts that were considered demilitarized zones. Same over here by Egypt, because Egypt has all this up to the Sinai Peninsula. And we will talk about the war, some of the events that happen next time we get together, and the aftermath of a lot of this, because the thing is, even in the aftermath of this, nobody tried to make an Arab state when it came to the Arabs. They still had land. They could have done it. That was never going to be enough. So we'll talk about that next time. So we'll stop here. And if there is anyone has questions or discussions, we can do that. Do I have